Home on August the 8th, 1978. Worrying ourselves in time. Why don't you, you're going to be speaking about your girlhood on the farm, and why don't you tell us when that was?
All right, you want me to tell when I was born?
Yeah, okay,
1910. 1910. When I was 2, my parents and I moved to a farm near a little town called Montgomery. And this town was named in honor of Thomas Montgomery, who was one of the earliest prominent settlers in this county. It lies in the northeast part of Trigg County and embraces one of the finest and most productive agricultural regions in Kentucky. Now, this description I've just given you was a quote from Perrin's History of Trigg County, which was written in 1884.
So you grew up on the farm. Was this strictly a family-operated farm?
Yes. My father was a hard-working man, and he took a great pride in his farming. In fact, he took a pride in everything he did. He was quite active in community activities, too. He didn't use power that we would call horsepower by engines, as you do with engines today, but he literally used mule power. Mm-hmm. And that, along with what he called elbow grease, the work that was done by hand, did all the work on the farm. All of his equipment was on steel tires. I remember how thrilled we were when we got our first rubber tires on the farm. They were on a buggy. And he specified that that was to be used for special travel only. He did all the work alone except at tobacco cutting and wheat threshing time. The men in the neighborhood would pool their work and their equipment at tobacco cutting time, and they would move from farm to farm until it was all finished. And then on what seemed to be about the hottest day of the summer, the wheat thresher would move in with 3 or 4 workers who camped along as they progressed through the community. All the women and men and children of the community would gather at one particular farm each day. And the men would bring wagons and teams, and they would haul the wheat shocks to the thresher. And then they in turn would haul the bags of wheat to the grain. The women would prepare food, trying to satisfy the hearty appetites of these men who were doing this hard work. And we children usually just ran wild. I remember on one occasion when I was 4, I had a heat stroke as a result of one such day as that at our house.
What was the thresher like?
It looked something like our combines of today, except, of course, it didn't pick the grain up from the ground. The grain, when the thresher arrived, the grain had already been cut and put in what we call shocks. And, of course, the combine just moves over the ground and picks the grain directly from the plant, rather than it's having to be cut in advance. It did the same work. It took the men plus the team and the wagons and the thresher to do the work that the combine now can do.
How was it? Was it steam powered?
Yeah, it was steam powered. Each year, just a few weeks ago, they had a fair down in somewhere down in Tennessee, and one of our neighbors, Wallace Freeman, always exhibits old threshers. He has quite a collection of them. And he takes them each year. He keeps them on display at his house just up the road. All through the time, people come from around to see these old threshing machines that he has collected.
So would this be a local man who would own this machine?
Usually it was. Sometimes he came from another county, but usually it was someone within the county who, of course, today it's nothing uncommon for people who grow wheat to have their own combine. But then It was very rare for a farmer to own his own thresher. Just a few people owned them, and they did what we would call custom work today. You see.
How would he be paid?
I suppose he was paid by money, but I do not have any recollection of ever knowing the charges, how much he received. I suppose he was probably paid by the number of bushels of wheat that he threshed, but I really don't know that. I expect that would be right.
You don't think he was paid like, in some areas I've found that the man with the thresher was paid, at least in some instances, by keeping a certain portion of the
I
wheat.
don't think so. I don't remember that he had any way of taking the wheat on with him as he went on. He just came in with a thresher. And I think he left just with the thresher too.
Was most of your wheat crop for sale? Or did you then sell it, or did you use it on the farm?
Yes. We used, of course, some of it. We had it ground into flour at Cage's Milling Company in Cage's. And we had a flour barrel, and it was always a rule that flour barrel must be at least half full, and it held 196 pounds. And that was for a family of 3. The flour was used, of course, my mother made biscuits, pancakes, cakes, all sorts of pastries, yeast rolls, and loaf bread, all those things. And then the surplus was sold to the milling company.
What about other crops?
We also grew tobacco, dark tobacco, when I was a child, and then later on we added early tobacco in I'd say my early teenage years. We added early. We grew hay and corn. There was usually a sprinkling of what we call mole beans and sunflower plants also around among these other plants that were growing on the farm.
Those beans, I don't think I've ever heard of them.
The mole bean seed is supposed to kill mold, and so they were sprinkled around to prevent the moles burrowing in the yard and around the tulip bulbs and other bulbs, flowers and so forth. I wish I had some seed now, because they really seemed to do the trick in those days. And we are, in fact, most everyone is bothered with mold where you have bulbs of any kind. The sunflower seed, my mother fed to her chickens. And I was amused about 2 or 3 weeks ago to read that some scientist has just recently discovered that there's quite a bit of nutritive value in sunflower seed. Evidently my mother must have thought that about 40, 50, 60 years ago. The corn was fed, of course, to the farm animals, and we also took some of it to Little Mill, which is this creek here is called Sinking Fork Creek, and Little Mill was located where Sinking Fork Creek came out of the ground. And I used to go there with my father and see the mill wheel as it turned and ground the meal, corn into meal. And we also had a meal barrel, and that had to be kept half full too, and that was used in making cornbread. Now that was for our use. Also my mother fed that to chickens and other fowls and things that were around. And some corn was sold, but very little. Most of it was used for feed for the animals and for the making of meal for us.
What about the animals on the farm? You've mentioned some of them.
The animals on our farm were, as I mentioned, mules. And, of course, they were used for the farm labor.
How many mules did you use?
Usually had 4. They were used 4 mules were used to pull wagons when they were heavily loaded, and then 2 mules would be used at old corn planting and various types of equipment that were, of course, all of them were mule drawn. We had a horse that was used for transportation, both to pull a buggy and to ride as horseback too. And we had cows and hogs and sheep, goats, dogs and cats and chickens and turkeys and guineas, pigeons. I think that about included everything we had on our farm. The hogs, along with the cows, produced a certain amount of needed cash from time to time when they could be sold. And of course the cows produced all of the milk and the butter and the buttermilk and the cottage cheese that we used. We always kill a butchered one in late fall to have for winter use. And my father, almost every weekend, would butcher a sheep or a goat for some of the local restaurants that were in town. They would run mutton specials over their weekends to do that. On the coldest day in the winter, we usually had hog killing. And again, all the neighbors, the men, the women, and the children would gather at your home, and the men would do the work of dressing the animals and blocking them out. And the women usually helped with the rendering of the lard and the grinding and packing of the sausage. And some of them, of course, cooked this meal for all those hungry people. And I remember that meal always included a huge pot of stew made from the fresh livers, melts, sweetbreads, and so forth, from the pork that had been killed just that day. This usually came soon after Christmas, and we children, each one had got one toy at Christmas, so we would take that toy with us, and we usually just had a real jubilee when we met for that holiday. I remember that our family was especially fond of pork, and in fact it's still just about my favorite meat, I think. And I was thinking this morning, we had preaching only one Sunday a month at our church, and on the Saturday just before that Sunday each month, my mother would bake a ham that averaged about 18 or 20 pounds. Of course that made 12 hams. And then she always baked one at Christmas and on some other special occasion. And she had a knack for doing that. She was a good cook. And the family and friends always enjoyed that little special flavor that it had. But that has come down to us, I think, on down to our family, that pork, even though we know we aren't supposed to eat it, is one of our favorite meats, I think.
Would you have the minister at the church over for dinner?
Usually, oftentimes. I might say we lived on the railroad, and oftentimes the minister came in the train. So it was very convenient to drop off at our house on Saturday to be there for the Saturday evening or sometimes the afternoon service. And then sometimes he came back to catch the train on Monday morning out, So he was there quite often. Not too much, but quite often he was there. The dogs belonged to my father. He always had at least one good what he called a coon hound. Because hunting and fishing were his favorite sports. And the cats that I mentioned were mine. Sometimes, one time I remember I had 21, including the mother cats and all the kittens. There was always one favorite one that my mother would let sit behind the kitchen stove. But all the others were banned to the stock barn where they kept the rats and mice away. And my mother sold the extra eggs that the chickens produced, and that was sort of her cash project throughout the year. Then the turkeys were her winter money, her Christmas money, so to speak, because she usually sold them around Thanksgiving. That gave her some money for Christmas. And I can't remember very much about the guineas, except they gave a continual patrack. You know that sound that they make, and that was supposed to predict rain when they stood around and patrack continually. I remember they had a real dark meat, and the eggs were small with thick shells and real rich yolks. My mother liked to use them for baking yellow cakes and custards and things like that. And then the pigeons were my cash project. At one time I had 75 of them. And I sold the young ones to Miss Malone at the hotel down at Katie's for 25 cents apiece. And people came from far and wide to eat her squab dinners that she would serve. Squab. That's what the young pigeon is called, a squab. They're sold before they're old enough to fly. And I guess the word squab because they are fat at that particular stage in their life. I think that's all the animals that we had, or most of them.
What would you do with the money you made from selling the pigeons?
Well, I kept a little checking banking account along. I guess it was a nest egg, probably, for my eventual going to school. Wish I had it, but I remember years ago there was a little piece came out in Katie's record about my pigeons and how many I had and how they were used and so forth. But I don't have that clipping. I wasn't inclined to keeping things in those days, so I wish I had that clipping. Don't have that.
So what about, in addition to the field crops, what kind of...
Well, in addition to field crops, we always had a large garden plot, and we had numerous truck patches in which we raised food to sell and to store for winter. And then we had an orchard, and we had a strawberry patch. Our garden usually had as many as 20 vegetables in it, and I jotted some of them down when I was thinking through this. And I can remember that we grew green beans, beets, cabbage, carrots, cucumbers, corn, cantaloupe, mustard, turnip greens, kale, collards, onions, okra, parsnips, hot and sweet pepper, green peas, peanuts, lettuce, white and sweet potatoes, radishes, rhubarb, squash, tomatoes, turnips, watermelon. And then in these patches we grew all kinds of brown peas such as black-eyed, crowder, purple hull, whippoorwill, and all kinds of beans such as native, pinto, kidney. So we had quite a variety of foods that we produced other than the regular field crops. Many of these were preserved for winter, and some of them were sold. At that time, the stores in Cadiz did not have access, of course, to fresh fruit and vegetable trucks. So they were glad to have to bring into them fresh fruits, vegetables, and so forth to sell. So, in fact, that was the source of their supply of fruits and vegetables at that time. The local people. Right.
Question that came to mind earlier, I didn't ask them, but on the tobacco crop, how would they get the tobacco crop? Where would they market the tobacco crop?
The tobacco, dark tobacco. Did you say how or when?
Well, where?
Well, it was marketed, in early spring, sometimes as late as April. Where now, of course, dark tobacco is marketed long before Christmas, usually. It was marketed in Hopkinsville or Clarksville. Time was, beyond my memory, when it was marketed at Canton and was shipped out by boat, but I don't remember that, but I've heard that mentioned. My father always took his to Hopkinsville. And I have also heard him mention, concerning prices, that at one period along the way, $3 per 100 was considered a good price. And of course, this past year, $130 for 100 pounds was considered. $1.30 for a pound was considered good. So you can see the
Things
difference.
changed.
But it brought him in. And the work was just as long and just as hard then, probably more so, than it is now.
The dollar brought a lot more back then.
Oh yes, the dollar bought more than the I don't believe though that the 3 cents for a pound then would buy as much as $1.30 for a pound would now. I believe it would.
It'll probably have inflation hasn't been that bad.
I don't believe it would.
Did he take it to Hopkinsville on wagons?
On wagons, yes. Usually the men of the neighborhood again would pool their wagons, and several of them would go along together because road conditions were difficult. And in case of trouble, they like to have someone along. It was a long, drawn-out procedure. They usually spent at least one night away from home, sometimes 2, you see. Oftentimes they'd leave around midnight, I know, and then go through the night. Maybe they'd get finished the next day, maybe they would not have to spend another night before they could start back home. We lived about, Montgomery was about, I guess about 5 miles from Gracie. And about 15, between 15 and 20 miles they had to travel by me.
And the road was just dirt out.
It was just a dirt road, yes. They went up, Montgomery, of course, is on 68. What's now 68. They went up 68, but it was a dirt road, and it remained a dirt road until just before my husband and I married, soon 44 years ago. He was helping build that house. He worked on that house.
1934.
So it's been quite a number of years. It was long, and I can remember when there were patches between our house and Katie's on 68 that the holes were so deep that my daddy would have to stand on the stirrup, on the buggy on one side to keep us from turning over. Remember that, the roads were terrible. And marketing tobacco was a big problem because of distance and weather conditions at that time.
Another thing I wanted to ask before we move into before we start talking about preserving foods, what were some of your chores other than raising your pigeons?
I usually looked after the chickens. We had a few chickens. Now I looked after them. I usually had a pet pig, maybe a pet lamb that I had to feed. And sometimes the mother sheep wouldn't take care of them, especially if they were twin lambs. I usually had a pet lamb. And I helped my mother some with the housework. I don't think I was an overly industrious little girl, to tell you the truth, as I look back on it. I remember the 2 jobs that I disliked doing most of all were churning and washing dishes. And I still don't like to wash dishes. And of course I've long since quit churning, but there were 2 things I just disliked, especially. I always liked to help with the cooking, and I especially liked to do the sewing. My mother did not sew. So I began sewing when I was 6, standing up, treadling a foot treadle machine, standing up and sewing on an old machine in the attic. The machine had belonged to my grandmother. And I learned to sew really on my own and off up there by myself. So that was one of my favorite things that I liked to do.
Did your family make a lot of their own clothes? Or?
My mother did not sew at all. She usually, of course, there weren't too many clothes to be bought. And if there had been, we probably didn't have the money to buy them. So we usually would have someone come in. There used to be girls and women who would go around and spend a week with a family and sew. And so one of them maybe would come to our house sometime and spend a week, usually in the spring and again in the fall. And I loved that week because I stayed right by her side all the long time, watched her cut and pin and sew and all that, because I didn't have that experience. The rest of the thing was my mother didn't sew. My mother was an excellent cook, and she had a sister who was an excellent seamstress. So, I think that came because each one had done one assigned duty at home, rather than helping with both types of work. My father used to tell the story when they first married. He was going to do some carpentry, and he asked her to make him a nail sack. And she made it, but he couldn't get his hand in it. He looked at the nails when she got it finished. So she just really didn't know anything, and never did learn about something. She did lovely handwork. I think the sister did the sewing, turned it over to her to do the buttonholes, the hemming, putting on lace, those things that were done by hand, because the sister liked to work fast and do the machine work. So my mother did lovely handwork, but she did not do any type of machine sewing.
Let's see, why don't you tell me about your ways of preserving foods back then?
All right, we preserved a lot of food for a family of 3 when I look back on it. Of course, we sold some of these foods after we had preserved them. The method we used most, quite likely, was drying, and we used the sun, just the regular sun heat, and we dried such foods as apples and peaches for our home use. We also sold some of them, took them to the grocery, and we experimented sometimes, and if you were successful, grapes and damsons sometimes turned to raisins and prunes. That was not, you weren't always successful, but sometimes you were. Of course, we shelled a lot of things like beans, all those brown beans and navy beans, and all those brown peas and popcorn and peanuts and hickory nuts and walnuts and corn that we made into hominy. And we used what we needed of those, and we also sold those things. Then another method that my father used was what he called a kill or a hill. And he would dig out a little bed on a well-drained spot and line that with straw. Then he'd put his food there and then cover it with straw and then dirt, leave a little vent for the moisture to escape. And food would be preserved there through the winter. Now you could use that for such things as fall apples and fall pears that were still firm when you were to them in. We also used it for quinces. Do you know what quinces are? That's a type of fruit that has a real puckery taste. Looks more like a pear than any other fruit. I was very fond of them, and they make delicious preserves. I can remember as a child, I used to take them to school, and all the children would want a bite, and then one bite would be all they want. But I have always been very fond of them. We also cooked potatoes and turnips, cabbage, onions. They were fall foods that would go into this hill or kill, and they kept quite nicely there all winter.
May I interrupt you a minute? Okay. Is that train still? Is there a train that still runs between Kansas?
Yes, I think it just makes one trip per day. I remember when I was in school over at Western, we had one teacher that always liked to know something about every student. And when he called my name and asked me where I was from, and I told him Katie's, and he said, now that's where they have that tri-weekly train. He goes to Gracie one week and tries to get back the next. But I think it runs about once a day.
You mentioned you were talking with us before when you were going to college at Bowling Green.
Yes, I went to Western. It was a normal school when I went there. Many students from this county, I didn't do this, but many students from this county who didn't find it convenient to go to high school because of transportation went over there and did their high school or normal school work. And then, of course, they would stay on and then do their college work. They have long since dropped the normal school part of it, or the high school part of it. But it was a normal school. And teachers' college is what it was called when I went there. It was just made a university in the past few years. I don't remember, about 6 or 8 years ago it became a university.
When did you attend?
I finished high school in 1927 when I was 16. And I went there, went to Western in the fall of 27, stayed through 31. That was right in the middle, of the Depression. And I didn't know whether I'd be able to stay 4 years or not. I wasn't old enough to get a job, because in those days, there weren't any 10-cent stores for girls to get jobs as sales girls in. And it was almost impossible for a 16 or 17-year-old girl to get a job. So I took the requirements for what they called a life certificate that you could get at the end of 2 years, because you could begin teaching with that. But I was able to stay on the 4 years, and I worked my way. Many people worked their way through school by teaching a rural school a few months out of the year, then coming back over there to school part of each school year. Again, I wasn't old enough to do that, so I just worked over there. At one time, I had 3 jobs. I had one job. I did various things, but I forgot just which one I was doing at a particular time, but it was something in the kitchen. And that gave me my meals. Things I did in the kitchen. One year I waited tables, waited basketball boys' tables. And they were the eatingest boys I've ever seen, but the nicest group I think I've ever worked with. And then I washed dishes and I sliced bread by hand. We didn't have an electric bread slicer. Of course, bread in those days was bought in the loaf unsliced. I sliced bread. I made salads. And that's about all I did there. Then other years I ran a mimeograph machine one year, and you had to be bonded to do that because you swore you wouldn't steal tests out or let tests out. I worked in the president's office one year and ran errands. There were no intercom system. So just about time I'd get to the 3rd floor of one building with a message and get back to his office, there'd be a message to take to the 3rd floor of another building, and of course all that was done by foot. Then the last year I was there, I was assistant matron in the dormitory in which I had lived at Potter Hall. But one time when I was working in the kitchen, one of those jobs in the kitchen, I was making my board that way. Then I had a job for a laundry, checking out all the laundry and dry cleaning that they did to girls in the dormitory. And as a result of that, I got partial care of my clothes. I got my laundry and dry cleaning free. And I also sold newspapers, the Sunday paper, and got a little spending money. I sold them there in the dormitory. They would deliver them, and I'd deliver them early Sunday morning. And then in time, sometimes I'd get my room. I worked for various parts of my. I did sewing for faculty members and their children for spending money. I did babysitting for faculty members, and I helped some faculty members' wives with refreshments for parties and things like that. That would usually be on a Saturday afternoon. I did all types of work to earn money for home economics courses. All required fees, $5 fee, $10 fee, things like that. So I had all those fees I had to take care of. So I did all types of work. I did sewing for some sewing for students there in the dormitory. I worked a lot of my way through school. My parents could have sent me. It probably would have been on a borrowing basis. And fortunately, we didn't have to do that. And I was glad later, because when I began teaching school, I got my first salary was $90 a month. And one month I got $90. The next month I would get what they called a warrant. And at face value that was worth $45. But if you kept it until they were ready for you to turn it in, you got it schooled out. So fortunately my parents were able to come to my rescue at that time, pay my room, pay my board where I was teaching. And I didn't have to cash my warrants in at the $45 value, but could hold until face value. All of that still came within depression time when I began teaching.
Before you were telling me about going through Guthrie on the train.
Yes, we went to Bowling Green by way of Guthrie on the train. In the later years, they put buses on, but in the earlier years, when I first went there, that was just the only way you could get to Bowling Green was to go by train. And we always stayed over at least 3 hours in Guthrie, no matter which way you were going, or I think no matter where you were going. You stayed that long in Guthrie. And we would come back there in groups, of course, for various vacations and things like that. So I have attended ice cream suppers and pie suppers and various social activities that they were having in Guthrie. We would attend as a group sometimes. Sometimes we were quite a welcome group because we would have maybe our evening meal with them for a supper of some sort. We had lots of fun there, and I haven't been to Guthrie in a long time, but I don't think you get through it much more easy, though, than you did back then from things I hear. You still have weights there.
I've been told that the restaurant they had at the train station, or there in Guthrie, was really fun.
True. I haven't been to Guthrie in quite a number of years. I just don't remember the last time I was over there.
This was back in I think the time that you were talking about. Interviewed him earlier about